This is part 2 of Chapter 5, The Police Role in Society. Now, we've already talked a lot about discretion in the role of police and how they use that in carrying about their duties. And it's this idea that there's often two or more options that someone can take in terms of carrying out an act. And in this case, we look at the duties that are placed upon police officers. And so all police officers operate under certain duties or responsibilities that come with their profession. However, as the individuals carry out those duties, there's a great deal of discretion that is involved in terms of choices that officers make. So one study by Wilson identifies these three typologies, he calls them, or different policing styles. The first is the legalistic style, which allows for the least exercise of discretion. And it's the idea that police officers are expected to carry out the law objectively, doing the same thing in every situation with every person, not making accommodations for the individual person or individual exceptions. The second is the watchman style of policing, where police are expected to look at situations in terms of threats to society, individuals or groups posing threats to society and the community that they're responsible for, and then officers taking actions against those individuals and groups accordingly, acting as the watchman. And finally, there's the caretaker style that sees police officers as taking care of people differently in a community based upon their relative power and position, where an individual officer exercises discretion in carrying out his duties based on the particular person involved or this particular situation involved. The exercise of discretion by a police officer comes into play every day, every shift that they go out on. Numerous situations where they have to respond to a scene and make some type of decision in terms of how they're going to carry out their duty. And a lot of these situations are ones where there's just not a clear-cut answer. A lot of these situations involves people in mental health crisis. The text has a great section kind of tracking the deinstitutionalization of mentally ill people in our country that began in the 60s and continued through the 70s. As our country moved away from institutionalization of the mentally ill, granted, to address a number of deficiencies in the mental health system then, what we are faced with now is an overwhelming amount of mentally ill people out just in regular society. And when regular society encounters someone who is mentally ill, they tend to call the police. A lot of times we see this in the homeless population, and that manifests itself in trespass situations where homeless people are staying on individuals' private businesses or homes, where mentally ill and the homeless steal to provide for their basic needs. And so naturally citizens call the police to intervene, and the police come out and find not a violent criminal but someone in a mental health crisis. And so a lot of times their options are limited as to what to do. A lot of times police end up having to make an arrest and take that person to jail. And so what has happened as a result of that is our local jails, remember, jails are a product of local government, prisons are a product of state government. Our local jails, city jails and county jails, have an inordinately high population of people suffering from mental illness, and without any other residential facilities to treat them, our local jails become de facto mental health hospitals. And so officers have to use discretion. Do I take this person who's in a mental health crisis to jail, or do I try and find some other way to deal with them? Another situation involving the use of discretion is in domestic violence situations. Historically, police had taken the approach of not interfering in these types of cases, especially in some domestic violence situations where you've got victim who, for various reasons, doesn't want the abuser arrested. And so typically then police would just back out of that situation and not intervene. Over the last several decades, our society has entrusted police with the authority to make arrests in those situations, even when the victim doesn't want to, for the victim's own protection. However, one of the most dangerous situations a police officer can be called out to is a domestic violence scene, because the level of tension is high. You have an offender who's often present. You have a victim who oftentimes will change their mind about whether they want the police involved, and so officers have to make decisions based on their discretion about whether to make an arrest at all, and if so, whom to arrest and how to carry it out. Further discussion on officers exercising discretion in terms of dealing with mentally ill patients. There has been a tremendous uptick in training officers on crisis intervention in terms of how to de-escalate situations involving someone who's having a mental health crisis. And that training has just involved education on what type of mental health conditions exist and how they may manifest themselves. How to determine whether someone is having a mental health crisis or they're just someone with a disability. As our country has seen a rise in autism, officers routinely encounter someone who is on the autism spectrum, who therefore has a disability and may not be complying appropriately, may not be responding appropriately, and so officers are being trained to discern, is this resistance? Is this intoxication, or is this someone who has a disability, or is it someone who's having a mental health crisis? This training involves bringing officers through scenarios where they're called upon to in live action, use skills to try and de-escalate situations, practical application. Also, there has been a rise in collaboration between law enforcement agencies and mental health providers and community leaders, so that actual teams go out into communities responding to certain calls, and an officer is in charge of that scene. But if this team is called out to someone who is in crisis or creating a disturbance, the officer first controls the scene, and then mental health professionals are present at the scene to try and make a determination. Is this someone who's committing a crime, or is this someone who's in mental health crisis, so that that person can be diverted from jail and directed to appropriate mental health resources. Like every profession, law enforcement has developed a code of ethics for police officers. And the text talks about the fact that having this written code of ethics, this codified scope of conduct, helps to promote self-respect in individual officers, and also helps to promote respect in the profession. It provides a standard to which individuals feel called, and then those individuals collectively in their profession raise the level of professionalism in their agency. The International Association of Chiefs of Police is the association that developed this code of ethics. They have developed an oath of honor. The text talks about various ways that these codes of ethics and oaths can be employed within organizations. Are they just some piece of pretty writing hung on the wall, or is it a code and an ethical system that is not only framed on a wall, but put into practical application throughout the agency day by day? The difference in that will determine whether officers respect that or not, and whether they aspire to maintain that code or not. And as with any group, there is the formal culture, there is if it's a professional group, there is a code of ethics, but there is also a subculture that exists in law enforcement, just like there's a subculture that exists in just about every other profession and organization. And so the text identifies some common elements that are found within the subculture of law enforcement agencies. And it develops because of the nature of the work that police do. The text talks about the fact that they typically form this homogenous social group. In other words, cops like to hang out with cops. We see this characterized in a lot of movies, especially of Boston police officers, right? You've seen the movie that talks about the Boston bar where only cops go to, right? Because police officers identify with one another and the unique stresses that they face, they tend to hang out with one another. They tend to develop kind of a closed social system. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be very supportive, but it does carry some dangers as well, because like any other subculture, it can become isolated and it can develop negative behaviors. So in the subculture, this police subculture, certain themes can develop, and some studies by Van Manen and Herbert identified this, that police can fall into a pattern of stereotyping the type of people that they come in contact with, and the text identifies some names that police tend to identify the people that they tend to encounter most. Thugs, lots of other different names that are in the text, and we'll just leave it at that. But there's this tendency to stereotype an adversary, and so when police fall into the warrior type mentality, it can be easier to work against a group that you characterize by stereotype. And another study identifies this tendency to overgeneralize and identify people based upon group or neighborhood, and then treat people the same way based upon that stereotype, that generalization, or that group, instead of treating people as individuals. And so some of the studies have identified these themes that can be found in subcultures that can develop in law enforcement. This idea of loyalty toward one another being foremost, an idea that it's an us against them mentality, them being the public, them being the criminals, and sometimes them being the management of a law enforcement agency. You may have seen these memes floating around the internet. It says sometimes there's justice and sometimes there's just us. And that's not the right way to look at things, but that's certainly a theme that can develop in a culture that adopts an us versus them mentality. Some of the other themes that can develop, and sometimes these are not always inherently bad, but it can produce bad results. There's an importance of maintaining respect among peers and of being shown respect by police officers, colleagues, and by the citizens that they serve. Officers have to be careful that they don't fall into the idea that the ends justify the means. Remember, we talked about the due process model of policing, where the end doesn't justify the means. The means are fundamentally important to make sure that people are treated appropriately and fairly, and that they receive due process. There can be an overemphasis on the use of force to resolve situations rather than resorting to other de-escalation techniques. Officers can choose to respond to some crimes more than other. This idea of a sense of suspicion towards everyone and just overall cynicism can develop. Obviously, in a profession that is hyper stress, that involves lots of conflict, it can draw personalities that want adventure, that want that excitement, but that can produce some negative results as well. And there is the theme that police are the good guys overcoming evil. And you know what? That's a true thing. That's what police officers do. We vest them with authority to protect us from those who would do evil against us. However, the way that mission is carried out turns on ethical decisions and the value systems that govern police conduct. So you can have that theme, it's just how officers carry out that theme that matters. We talked about the ends justifying the means theme. The text identifies a source of that in what it calls noble cause corruption. In other words, the cause of law enforcement, protecting citizens from those who would do evil against them, is a noble cause. officers have to guard against the culture that could develop that justifies unethical, illegal conduct, or simply conduct that's outside of an individual agency's procedures for the purpose of accomplishing that end, of accomplishing catching the bad guys. And so agencies have to guard against tolerating this type of conduct. The text identifies this concept of testifying, which is actually a term used in the justice system, where police officers sometimes might be tempted to just bald-faced lie, but if not so much actual lying, but to kind of slant facts, leave out information, add information, push the edges of ethical conduct for the sake of accomplishing a conviction. Testifying meaning that they're giving testimony under oath, but shading the truth of that testimony for the purpose of accomplishing an ends that then violates the ethical rules that should govern their conduct. And the text also makes this note that the culture of policing doesn't itself support corruption, abuse of authority, bribery, things like that. All of that is reported and investigated. What can infect the culture of policing is the noble cause corruption, the idea that police need to catch the criminal, to stop the crime, to solve the case, whatever it takes. That's what the culture has to guard against. So there exists in law enforcement culture this concept that's sometimes referred to as the code of silence or the blue curtain of secrecy, in which police officers are encouraged either blatantly or even subconsciously to not give up another cop, to not turn in bad conduct, basically to don't be a snitch, but in the context of law enforcement as opposed to the context of a criminal enterprise. But it's the same concept. It is this subculture pressure to turn away from bad behavior by fellow police officers. There's also the idea that a good police officer can become corrupted over time simply by ignoring bad conduct, by refusing to call out someone who is committing ethical violations or worse, actual crimes, and that by remaining passive, they become beholden, right? They become beholden to other police officers who know they failed to report in this instance, and then who have something on them so that they can pressure them to not report in subsequent instances as well. This is the same type of trap that police officers can fall into as with correctional officers. If a correctional officer compromises their integrity one time to do a favor for an inmate, then that inmate now has something on that correctional officer, right? The inmate now has a certain amount of authority and power over the officer because the officer has done something wrong and somebody else knows about it. And so then by being beholden to someone who would abuse them, they can be coerced into committing further bad conduct. And so the text talks about the fact that sometimes police misconduct is not passive, sometimes it's active. Sometimes police officers get drawn into this situation where they commit a series of ongoing and increasingly unethical acts. The text also talks about this culture of loyalty that occurs in law enforcement, and it's the same type of culture of loyalty that is found in other professions as well, but there are some aspects of it that are particularly intense in law enforcement because officers find themselves depending upon one another in very stressful, very dangerous situations. So that builds a bond with one another, and with that bond comes loyalty. The esprit de corps, the loyalty to one another, the having your six idea, develops all the way beginning in the academy, goes through training, goes through the culture that develops and continues through agencies. And look, that loyalty in police work is not a bad thing in and of itself. It's only when that loyalty leads certain officers to turn a blind eye to bad conduct or to commit bad conduct themselves or assist another officer in covering it up, that becomes a negative thing. So to help fight corruption, every police agency has processes and investigative procedures in place through which officers should be able to come forward and disclose unethical conduct or worse by fellow officers, and internal investigations can be commenced. When those processes work, the whistleblower, the person who comes forward to report bad conduct, should be protected. Now the problem is a lot of times things that work in concept don't work in application, and so dangers arise in organizations where the leadership will out those who come forward to disclose bad conduct, will actually retaliate against officers who bring bad conduct to light, either implicitly or explicitly, or who can deny promotions or give just really terrible assignments to police officers who tend to be whistleblowers. Now that goes back to leadership, not in the agency itself and not in the process itself. And the text has this reference to Frank Serpico, who was an actual police officer who came forth to report misconduct. Excellent book, worth your read. Pretty good movie, worth your watch as well, based on a true story. And having pointed out all of these problems that have historically existed in police subculture and continue to exist today, the text does backtrack a bit and actually have some good news that there are indicators that the negative aspects of police culture are weakening. A lot of that comes from the fact that police forces now are more diverse than ever, and a lot of police forces are more and more reflecting the makeup of the community that they serve, which tends to weed out some of the negative behaviors that have historically existed. Police unions exist, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. For good, it can help by protecting frontline officers and staff from retaliation by administration. There are negative effects of police unions in that it can become difficult for effective law enforcement leaders to discipline bad actors in their organization, and even to fire them, and we'll talk about that in other parts of the course. The prevalence of civil litigation, that police officers who commit misconduct can be subject to civil liability as well. All of these things are indicators that the negative aspects of police culture are weakening as our society continues to move towards diversity and transparency and accountability.